Most people believe their financial problems begin when money runs out. They are wrong. The problem begins the moment money arrives, and almost no one has been taught to see it. Centuries before modern finance existed, Solomon observed two kinds of households: those who stored and those who devoured. The income was often the same. The outcomes were not. What separated them was not opportunity or effort. It was a single, quiet decision made in the first moment of receiving. If this challenges you, stay until the end. The money habit that quietly keeps people broke. Part 1 condensed. There is a moment most people recognize but rarely examine. It is the moment money arrives. A deposit clears, a paycheck is received, and for a brief interval, something shifts internally. A quiet relief, a sense of security. Then the mind starts moving through assignments, rent, groceries, the small reward that feels deserved. One by one, the money finds its destinations. And within days, that security has dissolved. This is not an indictment of those who spend Espanol. This is an observation about a behavioral pattern so embedded in modern financial life that most people have never questioned. Whether it is the correct response to receiving money, consider the result. A person earns a salary for 10 years. They meet obligations consistently. They are not careless. And yet, at the end of those 10 years, their financial position has not meaningfully changed. The income grew, the lifestyle adjusted, but the quiet structural accumulation of preserved wealth never formed. Most people trace the problem to the wrong moment. They assume trouble begins when money runs out. But what if the problem begins the moment money arrives, not the moment it disappears? Modern financial culture has constructed a specific story about wealth. Earn more, have more. Income rises, security rises with it. It is also, for most people, deeply misleading. A salaried worker receives a raise. Within weeks, the lifestyle expands automatically. Transportation is upgraded. Subscriptions are added. Dining habits shift upward. The income is higher. The financial security is not. This pattern persists because it does not feel like failure. It feels like reward. And that instinct to treat income as permission is precisely where the problem lives. Ancient observers understood this long before modern economists gave it a name. They understood that income and wealth are not the same thing. That the size of what enters a household has far less power than the discipline governing what remains. Centuries before modern banking, a different kind of wealth instruction existed. The Book of Proverbs, attributed to King Solomon, contains a verse that deserves careful attention. Proverbs 21:20. Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. The observation is not about how the wise man earned his treasure. The entire weight of the verse rests on a single behavioral distinction. One man stores, the other devours. This is not religious instruction. This is an economic observation recorded with extraordinary precision, thousands of years before modern behavioral finance arrived at the same conclusion. Ancient households understood something modern earners forget. Prosperity does not begin with earning. It begins with the treatment of what is earned. Consider two individuals with identical salaries, identical costs of living. One preserves a fixed portion of every payment before making any other financial decision removed first, placed beyond immediate reach, left undisturbed. The other addresses expenses first, lives comfortably on what remains. After 5 years, their incomes are identical. Their financial positions are not. Not because of opportunity. Not because of effort. Because one behavior practiced quietly and without drama created a structural difference that time eventually made visible. This is not motivational insight. It is mechanical. Change the structure, and the outcome changes with it. The structure being described has a name. The first reserve law. Before any spending decision is made, before obligations are addressed, before desires are considered, a fixed portion of income must be removed. Not what remains after expenses. Not what is convenient after the month resolves. First, the word matters more than it appears to. Visible money is interpreted as available money. Available money attracts decisions. And decisions, multiplied across the full surface of modern life, consume everything they touch. Remove first, then decide. The moment that order reverses, the moment spending precedes preservation, the mechanism breaks. Not dramatically, quietly, month by month. Until one day, the cycle is examined and no clear moment of failure can be identified. That is how this pattern works. It does not announce itself. It simply persists. There are two financial identities that quietly separate people over time. The consumer earner treats money arrival as permission. The full pull enters the visible space immediately. Life feels comfortable. Nothing is wasted carelessly. and yet months and years pass without structural change. The reserve builder removes a portion before decisions begin. The structure has become habitual, automatic, and beneath a life that looks, from the outside, almost identical. A foundation is forming, slowly, quietly, without announcement. Disciplined households do not celebrate income. The paycheck arrives, and rather than relief, there is something closer to neutrality. A calm recognition that the mechanism is operating. This emotional distance from income is not a personality trait. It is a practiced discipline. Wealth is not a function of how much arrives. It is a function of who you are, structurally, behaviorally, emotionally, in the moment that it does. And beneath this discipline, there is a deeper structural layer to this law. One that most people, even those who begin practicing preservation, never fully understand. That layer is where this inquiry continues. There is a question that emerges naturally from everything observed so far. If the first reserve law is this simple, remove first, decide later, why do so few people practice it consistently? The answer is not laziness. It is not ignorance. It is not even a lack of financial awareness. The answer is psychological. And understanding it is the difference between someone who tries this principle once and someone who builds their entire financial identity around it. When money arrives, the mind does not experience a neutral event. It experiences relief. And relief, by its nature, moves toward resolution. It seeks to convert anxiety into comfort. It looks for places to discharge the pressure that accumulated during the weeks between payments. The overdue obligation? The delayed purchase. The small reward that has been earned through effort and patience. This is not weakness. This is a deeply human response to scarcity and recovery. But it is also the precise psychological mechanism that the first reserve law is designed to interrupt. Because if preservation depends on what remains after relief has done its work, after the expenses are met, after the small rewards are collected, after the month has finished its demands, then preservation will almost never happen. Not because the intention is absent, because the psychological sequence has already consumed what the intention required. Ancient households understood something modern earners forget. Structure must precede emotion. Not suppress it, not deny it. Simply precede it. Remove the reserve before the relief begins its work. Then allow the relief to operate on what remains. The emotional experience is nearly identical. The financial outcome, over years, is not. This is the second structural principle of the first reserve law. The first principle was sequencing preservation before spending. The second principle is this: money grows where it is allowed to remain undisturbed, not through aggressive strategy, not through sophisticated instruments, simply through the protection of continuity. Capital that is preserved and left untouched does something that consumed capital cannot do. It accumulates duration. And duration, applied to preserved capital, produces an effect that no amount of income intensity can replicate. Most people have heard this described in financial terms. But the ancient understanding of it was not mathematical. It was behavior. The wise household in Proverbs was not described as one that invested skillfully. It was described as one that stored. The act of storage, of deliberate, patient preservation, was itself the mechanism. The results followed, not from strategy, but from restraint. Quiet discipline outlasts loud income. This phrase deserves to settle before continuing. Because modern financial culture is structured almost entirely around income, intensity, work more, earn more, optimize more. The underlying assumption is that the path to stability is found through the aggressive pursuit of additional resources. But the ancient observation points in a different direction entirely. The household that stores modest resources consistently will, over sufficient time, arrive at a position of stability that the household pursuing intensity but consuming everything it earns will never reach. Not because the storers earned more, because they allowed time to work on what they preserved. Time is the hidden lever inside the first reserve law. This is what most people fail to understand when they first encounter the principle of preservation. They imagine that the reserve itself is the asset, that the discipline of removing a portion first is the mechanism, but the reserve is not the asset. Time applied to the reserve is the asset. A person who preserves consistently for 1 month has practiced a discipline. A person who preserves consistently for 1 year has built a habit. A person who preserves consistently for 10 years has constructed a foundation, one that operates beneath the surface of daily financial life, quietly accumulating strength regardless of what the economy does, regardless of whether income fluctuates, regardless of the external conditions that dominate most people's financial anxiety. Preservation activates time. Consumption interrupts it. Every time the cycle resets, every time a payment arrives, is fully consumed, and the account returns to its starting position. The clock resets as well. Time cannot work on capital that no longer exists. It can only work on what has been allowed to remain. This is why the ancient instruction was not about earning more. It was about storing. The storehouse was not a symbol of accumulation for its own sake. It was the mechanism through which time could be put to work. Ancient households understood this without the vocabulary of compound growth. They simply observed that patient families with modest means eventually surpassed impatient families with greater income, and they recorded the behavioral distinction that explained why. Structure defeats impulse, always, over sufficient time, without exception. There is a discipline test embedded in the first reserve law that most people encounter and fail without realizing it was a test at all. It arrives in a specific moment. Income appears. And with it, immediately, a sense of deserving. The month was difficult. The work was real. The obligations were met. And now, with money visible and available, the instinct to reward the effort rises naturally. This instinct is not wrong, but its timing is the test. The discipline of the first reserve law does not require that reward be denied. It requires only that reward be delayed by one structural step. Remove the reserve. Then allow the relief, the reward, the consumption of the remainder to proceed without restriction. The test is not about sacrifice. It is about sequence. And those who pass this test, not once, not when motivated, but consistently, as a matter of behavioral structure, begin to notice something unexpected after months of practice. The anxiety that once accompanied the final days before a payment clears begins to soften. Not because more money is available. In the early stages, slightly less is available for immediate consumption. But because something has changed structurally beneath the surface, a reserve exists. It is growing, slowly. And its presence, quiet, undramatic, invisible to the outside world, produces a psychological calm that no amount of income intensity ever generated. Financial calm is not a product of having more. It is a product of preserving consistently. This distinction is one that modern financial culture almost never teaches, and it is one that ancient observers understood as the foundation of all durable prosperity. Preservation always precedes prosperity. As the reserve builds and the structure becomes habitual, something deeper begins to shift. It is not a financial shift. Not initially. It is a temporal one. The person practicing the first reserve law consistently begins to think in longer increments. Where once the financial horizon extended to the end of the month, to the next payment, the next obligation, the next reset, it begins to extend into years, into decades. Money stops feeling temporary. It begins to feel structural. And this shift in time horizon quietly changes the nature of every financial decision that follows. Purchases are evaluated differently. Impulses are processed differently. The question is no longer simply whether something can be afforded now. It becomes whether something belongs inside a life being constructed for the long term. This is the identity transformation that ancient discipline produces. Not a change in income. Not a change in circumstance. A change in how a person relates to money at the most fundamental level. Modern culture celebrates financial noise, the aggressive pursuit of income, the public display of acquisition, the visible signals of financial activity, the upgraded lifestyle, the announced achievement, the performance of prosperity. This culture is not simply superficial. It is structurally corrosive, because the public display of consumption reinforces consumption identity. Every visible signal sent outward, every purchase announced, every upgrade performed, deepens the association between money and spending, between income and permission. Disciplined wealth rarely announces itself. The households that practice the first reserve law consistently over decades do not typically display the visible markers that modern culture associates with financial success. They live, often, in ways that appear modest relative to their actual stability. This is not accident. It is architecture. Silence supports preservation. Noise undermines it. The ancient wisdom tradition did not celebrate visible wealth. It celebrated stored treasure, hidden, protected, accumulated quietly over time. The display of wealth was, in the Proverbs tradition, associated with the foolish household, not because prosperity was something to be ashamed of, but because display and consumption occupied the same psychological space. To spend visibly is to reinforce spending as identity. To preserve quietly is to reinforce preservation as identity. The choice, practiced daily, determines which identity takes hold. With this understanding assembled, a simple behavioral ritual emerges. It does not require a financial plan. It does not require an advisor or a system or a structured investment strategy. It requires only this: when money arrives in any form, in any amount, pause before assigning it entirely to spending. Remove the predetermined portion immediately, before the mind begins its work of distribution. Place it beyond the reach of the day's decisions. Then wait. Allow the relief to operate on what remains. Allow obligations to be met, desires to be addressed, life to continue. But do this with the knowledge that the foundation has already been secured, that the mechanism is operating beneath the surface, independent of the MOS events. Repeat this without exception. Not when convenient. Not when the month is favorable. Not when the income feels sufficient to permit it. Every time, because consistency is the variable that time requires to do its work. An inconsistent reserve builds nothing. A consistent reserve, even a modest one, accumulates duration, and duration accumulates strength. This is the entire discipline. It is not complicated, but it is not easy, because it must be practiced precisely when the emotional pressure against it is highest, in the moment of arrival. When relief is seeking resolution and the mind is already distributing what just appeared, that is the test. And passing it, repeatedly, without drama or announcement, is what separates the two identities that ancient observers described with such quiet precision. Return now to the verse that opened this inquiry. Proverbs 21:20. The wise man stores. The foolish man devours. Solomon was not describing the extraordinary. He was describing a behavioral choice available to anyone, practiced quietly, producing results that time eventually makes undeniable. Wealth was never hidden. It was never the product of secret knowledge or exclusive access or superior circumstance. It was always the product of a single structural discipline, practiced in the most ordinary moment of financial life, the moment money arrives, by people who understood that what they kept mattered infinitely more than what they earned. The modern world has made this moment more difficult. It has surrounded that moment with pressure, with temptation, with cultural instruction to consume. It has made the consumer-earner identity feel normal and the reserve-builder identity feel unusual. But the ancient observation has not changed. Quiet discipline outlasts loud income. Preservation always precedes prosperity. Wealth grows where money is allowed to remain. The person who internalizes this, not as a technique, not as a temporary strategy, but as an identity, does not simply manage money differently. They think differently. They experience the arrival of income differently. They relate to time differently. They make decisions from a different psychological position entirely. And that difference, compounded across years of consistent practice, produces something that no income increase, no market strategy, and no motivational framework ever could. A foundation, quiet, structural, durable, built not in a moment of inspiration, but in 10,000 ordinary moments, each one defined by a single choice made before the relief could begin its work. Reserve first. Decide later. The wise have always known this. Now, so do you. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more ancient wealth psychology, the knowledge that disciplined families have always kept quiet.